It's January 2024, and in search for a healthy dose of vitamin D, I've headed to the eastern Mediterranean and Cyprus's second city, Limassol. It's certainly one up on the sunshine and coastline front from Birmingham. Located on the southern coast of the island of Cyprus, 60 kilometres east of Paphos, west of Larnaca and south of the capital Nicosia, the country's second city is also sandwiched between two of its oldest cities, the long-since-abandoned cities of Kourion, 14 kilometres to the west, and Amathus, 10 kilometres to the east. There are graves in the area of modern-day Limassol dating back over 4,000 years, but the city itself likely only grew after Amathus had started to fall into ruin, a process speeded up in the events that put Limassol on the global stage. In 1191, as part of the Third Crusade, Richard the Lionheart took over control of the islands after landing in Limassol, ending the long period of Byzantine rule on the island and taking the opportunity of his victory to finally finish off Amathus, plundering what was left of the site for stone to help build in Limassol, along with moving the remaining residents of the ancient city there. Shortly after his conquest, Richard sold the island to the Knights Templar, who were after a new home, having just been ejected from Jerusalem, forming one stop on their long, slow retreat across the Mediterranean, being ejected from Jerusalem, Cyprus, Rhodes and Malta over the next half a millennium. Getting their feet under the table in their new home, one of the first acts of the Knights was to construct a fortification in the centre of the city, with a castle erected on the site of a former Christian basilica dating back to around the 6th century and an approximately 200-year-old Byzantine monument. It's likely that these buildings combined had been the city's first cathedral before the arrival of the castle, with construction being completed within 2 years of Richard the Lionheart's arrival. The castle proved to be a necessity as the town and fortifications came under sustained attack throughout the 13th to 16th centuries, alternating between the Genoese, the Mamelukes and Mother Nature herself with a series of earthquakes. After every attack and quake, the building underwent reconstruction and renovations. The island of Cyprus was sold to Venice in 1489, and the Venetians undertook work to strengthen the castle of Limassol. Not that it helped much, as less than 50 years later in 1538 the Ottomans briefly captured the castle and city before Venetians regained control. Deciding a fortification wasn't a good idea, the Venetians demolished the castle between 1567 and 68, perhaps unwisely, as 8 years later the Ottomans captured the whole island, this time taking control right up until the arrival of the British in 1878. The Ottomans took the opposing opinion that a fortress was probably a good idea and built a new fortress in the city, taking in the remains the original Venetian castle and expanding to create the building that stands in the centre of the city to today. The new fortification was completed around 1590, so at 430 years old, it's the longest lasting of the structures on the site. The underground chambers, which still show evidence of that early Christian basilica, and the first floor were transformed into prison cells, a role they held throughout the Ottoman and almost all of the British rule, right up until the 1940s, when prison accommodation on the island was transferred to a new central prison in Nicosia. With the apparent end of its role as a fortress and prison, the building was transferred to the Department of Antiquities and opened as the District Museum from 1948 until 1964, when it was handed back to the National Guard due to the intercommunal riots that were taking place on the island. With the castle out of action, work began on a new purpose-built District Museum which opened in March 1975. More on that shortly. The castle building was eventually handed back to the Department of Antiquities and in 1987 reopened as a museum housing the medieval collections of Cyprus Museum, focusing on the period from the early Christians to the Byzantine, Venetian and into the Ottoman eras. Today you climb up through the castle from the basement to the roof, taking the museum displays from the former prison cells, and from the roof excellent views out over the city of Limassol and into the Troodos Mountains in the distance. Two kilometres to the northeast of the castle is the site of that new district museum, which opened its doors in March 1975 to house antiquities and artefacts from the Limassol region dating from around the 10th millennium BC until the end of the Roman period. The finds are dominated by the two city kingdoms that sat on either side of modern-day Limassol, Kourion and Amathus. The bulk of the finds from Kourion are actually held in another museum close to the site of that city, but there's so much that was discovered at the city that the museum still has a reasonable set of artefacts. The main hall of the museum houses some of the oldest artefacts ever found on the island, with items dating back into the Neolithic era, as well as general finds from the Amathus location. In a separate site hall, there are some of the younger artefacts, though at nearly 2,000 years old, younger is relative in this case. This includes items from the Roman era of the city. But the main exhibition space is given over to some of the most important finds that were made from the site of the ancient city of Amathus, located just 8 kilometres east of the museum. Outside the museum, the courtyard houses some reconstructed mosaics. And down the side of the building, a display of some of the larger pieces that have been discovered at Amathus, from altars and columns to sarcophagi and giant jars. But to truly appreciate the scale of Amathus, it's best to hop on a number 30 bus, every 10 minutes from the city centre, out along the coast road to where the ancient kingdom once stood. It's not known when humans first settled the lands where Amathus would go on to be built, but there are traces back to at least the Neolithic period. Whilst discoveries of stone vessels were made during the Knights and Venetian period, it wasn't until 1893 that archaeological digs started to uncover the site, which had been almost completely abandoned by the 7th century, and which was finally cleared by Richard the Lionheart in the 12th century. But it's not just Richard that helped to destroy the site. The large harbour that once would have powered the economy of Amathus has long been lost to the sea. A combination of rising sea levels and coastal erosion mean to fully explore the ancient harbour, you either need to be a diver or a fish. Though in places there are still remnants of the ancient slipwades and large dressed rocks that made up parts of the harbour. Heading back inland, you reach the uncovered remains of a once great kingdom. High on the hill above the site sits the Acropolis and Sanctuary of Aphrodite, and then below them, almost at sea level, sits the remainder of the ruins. What is believed to be parts of the palace sit closest to the entrance to the archaeological park. The uncovered elements are believed to be linked to the palace storage areas. It's thought the palace was originally constructed around the 8th century BC and destroyed around 300 BC. Beyond the palace building sits the Roman market, and behind it the baths. The kingdom's heyday saw it trading with neighbouring countries and kingdoms, with suggestions that there are a number of Phoenician merchants who had settled in Amathus as it was such an important trading location. The abolition of the city kingdoms such as Amathus and Kourion during the Hellenistic period around 300 BC saw an end to the city's glory days, and the Acropolis and citadel on the top of the hill were likely abandoned around this time, with the population concentrating on the lower city area around the market and baths. The city survived the first of the Arab raiding parties in the mid-7th century, but soon afterwards the city started to be abandoned. By the time Richard the Lionheart made it here in the mid-12th century, there were just a handful of people living here, which he forced to relocate to Limassol, whilst also making use of the remnants of the city as a pre-cut quarry for stone and building materials for his new city down the coast. Part of the problem of putting a date on the founding of Amathus is there are suggestions it may have been founded by peoples who were already living on Cyprus. That's not a problem our next stop suffers from. Back along the coast, past Limassol and on past the Akrotiri Peninsula, you reach the other great ancient city on this part of the coast, Kourion. For Kourion, it's much more cut and dry. In the 12th century BC, Greek settlers from Argos arrived on Cyprus and settled at this site. By the 11th century BC, the kingdom of Kourion had been established at the foot of the cliffs, though the Acropolis wasn't established until the 5th century BC. Under the Romans, the kingdom of Kourion became a civic government and continued to flourish, and the site continued to do well until the 4th century, when the area was hit by 5 strong earthquakes in the space of 80 years, causing the near complete destruction of the site. Over the following centuries, parts were reconstructed, but most of the Acropolis remained abandoned, with the entire site being destroyed in Arab raids in the mid-7th century. The site is split into 2 main areas, the first being around the market and public baths, which make up the largest part of the site. Walking through from the colonnades to the markets, you soon reach the area of the public baths and the unmistakable sign of the hippocausts used to keep the different rooms of the baths heated. Beyond the baths is the remains of a house from the early Christian period of the site. And behind that is one of the key preserved buildings in Kourion, the House of the Gladiators, a 3rd century house which gets its name from the well-preserved mosaics of gladiators, one depicting gladiators in training and another of them fighting. A short walk further on and you reach the House of Achilles, named for the mosaic depicting the scene of Achilles revealing his identity to Odysseus. Back in the market area and next to the public baths is the Nymphaeum, a complex of buildings and additional baths built as a monument to the nymphs of ancient Greek folklore. At the rear of an Nymphaeum, you can look out over the site and get a good idea of the sheer scale and size of Kourion, with further ruins dotted on the hillsides hundreds of metres away. As well as more examples of former baths. Just beyond the market is the site of a 5th century Christian basilica, built in the last years of the city, possibly as a residence for the local bishop. Separated from the market, basilica and other houses across a ridge is the other part of the site, which houses the two largest structures still standing in Kourion. One of the best preserved buildings in the complex is the house and baths of Oustolios, which was constructed in the rebuilding works of the late 4th century on the site of an earlier structure. The complex had more than 30 rooms, many with elaborate mosaics that are still visible today. There was also a bathhouse attached to the building. Just below the house of Oustolios is the remains of the theatre, using the slope of the hill to create a natural amphitheatre. Unlike the house of Oustolios, no repairs were carried out to the theatre after the 4th century earthquakes, and instead the theatre that stands today is a result of restoration work carried out after its excavation in the middle of the 20th century. Four kilometres east of Kourion and nearly 1,000 years on from its heyday, you reach the castle at Kolossi. A former Crusader stronghold, the castle was originally built in 1210, but the current building is a result of rebuilding in 1454 following the castle's destruction during Mamluk raids in 1425 and 1426. Access was originally only possible via a narrow stair and drawbridge combination to the middle floor, which is still the main route in today, though it is also possible to enter via a gateway into the ground floor cellars. A series of steep stairs take you up through the two upper floors of the castle. And up onto the roof from where there are views out across the countryside and across to the Troodos Mountains. Limassol is located halfway between Cyprus's two main airports of Paphos to the west and Larnaca to the east, with regular coaches to both taking around 90 minutes. Larnaca is the larger of the two airports, home to Cyprus Airways and a hub for Aegean and Wizz Air, with year-round flights to much of Europe, the Middle East and North Africa, and seasonal flights to an even wider selection of European destinations. The smaller Paphos airport is a hub for Ryanair, as well as having year-round service to a number of British cities for various airlines, as well as seasonal flights to a wider range of European and Middle East destinations.